Every once in a blue moon, you might come across a piece of media that appeals to you from a very specific and laser-focused level. Whether that be because the characters are going through the very same things you've experienced or are experiencing, because you can relate to them on a personal level, or because they speak to you in ways that other media has never managed to do. We all tend to gravitate towards things that do this, whether we're consciously aware of it or not, which is why stories that do pull at the heartstrings of their audience in this way manage to appeal to people. If you're telling a story about a person who's going through a series of events that cannot be easily compared to events in the lives of its audience, with characters who don't showcase a lot of relatable human traits, you're going to struggle to find an audience who enjoys it. This is also why everyone's favorite characters are a little different from one another, because every person has a different story to tell and different lives that they have lived. Your favorite character might not even be a character you specifically relate to, but instead one that you're attracted to, or one portrayed by an actor that you're particularly fond of, both of which still tell a lot about you as a person. One of the things I've noticed in growing up is not only that a lot of stories may have been initially conceptualized by the writers when they were much younger, but also that a good writer will take these same childhood stories and fine-tune them to remove the flaws that potentially made it cringy teenage fantasy. This is what I want to discuss today. A series of characters that I gravitated towards initially out of an intrigue over their chaotic found family dynamic within a much more complex, bizarre, and intriguing narrative, but upon further reflection realized were essentially perfect tween fantasy bait. These are the Rowdy Three.
There's only two of you.
Oh, shut up, Math!
Okay, so first things first, I am going to be talking about some spoilery stuff for this show. Not a lot, but enough that I think it's important to make note of it. So before we delve too deeply into this, I want to give a vague description of the show so that if you haven't watched it, you can get a vibe as to whether this show is something that you might like watching. However, an important thing to note here is this show was never renewed for a third season. Just to preempt any potential disappointment you might get from that if you start watching it and don't know that fact. It left us with a lot of open threads and unanswered questions, so just be aware of that. Also, for the record, I am only talking about the 2016 television series when discussing the writing for these characters. There is a comic book and the original novel, both of which are very different, and I'm not talking about either of them today. If you guys happen to like this and you want me to explore characters from this universe a little more, as well as the differences between their incarnations, maybe I will. And because this whole video is going to be talking about nonconformist punks who go through a growth process and who later rise up to help others even in instances where they don't benefit personally, you know what's super punk? Rebuking genocide. Which is why I would like anyone with money to spare this holiday season to please donate to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Provided I do this correctly, there should be a fundraiser on this video to make things easy for you. Thank you. So, to begin, the characters that I'm going to be talking about here are not the main characters of the show. That role goes to the title character Dirk Gently and the man who would become his best friend, Todd Brotzman. Todd is your typical down-on-his-luck, straight white male protagonist, except his level of down on his luck, much like many protagonists I've seen come out of Douglas Adams' head, is cartoonishly inconvenient. He has an insane landlord who will outright resort to physical violence and destruction of property if he doesn't get the rent on time. He works a dead-end job that doesn't give two licks about him as a person. He's constantly struggling to keep afloat financially, made more difficult in him also having a disabled sister who is partially dependent on him, parents who can't help because they effectively went bankrupt helping Todd when he was younger, so there's this extra level of guilt you come to understand Todd is feeling about that, which does get expanded on a lot more as the show progresses, and overall, he just can't seem to catch a break. He is a man who lives paycheck to paycheck, meandering his way through life in what is effectively a self-isolationist slog of mediocrity. This is all turned on its head, however, when he becomes involved with Dirk Gently. If you've ever heard the trope of the manic pixie dream girl, then Dirk is the manic pixie dream boy, in that as soon as he's introduced to Todd's life, things start changing in very drastic and chaotic ways. Following the discovery of a bizarre multiple murder featuring giant teeth marks burned into the furniture and a missing kitten at the hotel he works at, Todd finds himself not only as a person of interest in the police investigation investigation of said murder, but also unable to shake this mysterious, socially inept, quirky British man who is seemingly already primed for the notion that the two of them will become best friends. He is very confident about that. Dirk describes himself as a holistic detective, and that he is a detective, but in that he doesn't go out looking for clues. Instead, all of the cases he takes on and every clue necessary to solving that case is something that comes to him naturally, regardless of his own input or goals. He effectively just has to live his life, bizarre and nonsensical as it may be, and the universe will guide him along the correct path into solving the case. Whether that be plopping him right in the middle of a dastardly plot, or just giving him an inexplicable hunch that he chooses to indulge in. In that sense, the entire first season introduces the audience to how Dirk's bizarre power works, and how all of these seemingly disconnected storylines eventually come together into a cohesive narrative. The serial killer who kidnaps a hacker after killing his employer and who is also obsessed with finding and killing Dirk gently. The badass personal bodyguard tied to the bed in the upstairs apartment. The missing daughter of the recently murdered socially reclusive billionaire entrepreneur. The detectives working her missing persons case. The cult of bald men with rhyming names and not a whole lot going on for them in the brain department. The elusive but clearly understaffed government agents keeping an eye on Dirk and referring to him as Project Icarus. Todd's own younger sister, and, relevant to today's video, the psychic energy-feeding vampire punks who follow Dirk around and terrorize him whenever they get hungry. Yeah.
Project Incubus.
May I introduce you to the Rowdy Three?
There are 4 of them. I'm wildly aware.
Don't question it. Side note, the music in this show is great. Big props to Cristobal Tapia de Veer because, damn, fantastic work. There's one scene in particular that always makes me tear up a little bit, and while the scene itself is moving to an extent, I think a lot of that does come from the music and exactly how fitting it is. Now, despite acting as a group, each member of the Rowdy Three has their own individual brand of chaos and personality. Martin, seemingly the eldest and certainly the most verbally articulate of the group.
Oh shit, that is good!
While the rest of the boys are indulging in their wanton destruction, Martin is the one who's keeping an active eye out for danger. He's the one who guides the boys to their destinations, being the member who drives the van they live out of in the first season, and in watching the 4 of them interact, you will notice that Martin is the leader figure that the rest of them follow without question or hesitation. If Martin says smash, they smash. If Martin says let's bounce, they bounce. And if Martin says rough 'em up boys, you better heckin' run. Actually, that's not true. In fairness, Martin mostly whistles at them. Then we have Grips, the soft-hearted strongman with a great sense of color and who I am of the mindset is autistic coded.
There's a lot of weed in here.
How long we been in here, man?
7,776,000 seconds. I have no idea what's going on here.
Big time.
There's 11,000 dudes. I counted real quick.
Arguably my favorite of the 4, which is a shame given how little screen time he actually gets. Next up is Cross, the crowbar-wielding Hispanic hype man.
I'm Cross.
That's what he said.
Probably the loudest of the group, he plays Scrabble. He and Grips almost have this, like, twin-like middle child-brother relationship that I think is kind of cute. If you've seen Rise of the TMNT, you could very easily compare their dynamic to the disaster twins that are Leonardo and Donatello, if they were trash punks and way more violent. And finally, Jacob Vogel, the youngest and newest member of the group when the series begins. Vogel notably has a lot of youthful energy to him. Like, look at how Grips holds him back and gives him piggybacks. He's a rowdy little kid on a leash. It's adorable. It should also be noted that he does not remain the newest member of the group for long. We are introduced to the Rowdy Three first as a destructive, terrifying force, who come in seemingly out of the blue and disrupt Todd's life in ways that no one could have predicted, breaking into Todd's apartment building, kissing every surface with the business end of a baseball bat, and behaving in a way that draws as much attention to themselves as possible. They are, effectively, the ultimate culmination of the chaos and destruction that will be introduced to Todd's life as a result of him interacting with Dirk, basically thrusting us into the deep end of the kind of lunacy that follows this man around. You thought Todd's life as a cog in the machine, beholden to the dead-end role of his job, and dealing with a violent psychopath who sucks out whatever life he had was intense? I tell you right now, Dirk's got him beat. In that sense, the first thing on your mind when you see these guys is the thought that they are coming here to physically injure someone. Whether it be Todd or Dirk, we can't immediately be sure, but there is that immediate fear of physical danger. This is compounded because while they are actively destroying Todd's property, they are making threatening comments implying that they're going to hurt someone. Frankly, if 4 raging gutter punks leapt out of a van and started destroying everything in sight and screaming out what they were going to do to your face, you'd probably be terrified out of your mind too. This interaction also hints to us as the audience that there's some weird supernatural shit going on here, and Dirk is seemingly at the center of it. See, after having sufficiently destroyed Todd's apartment and reducing Dirk to a quivering emotional wreck on the floor, never once laying a hand on either of them, mind you, the Rowdy Three crowd themselves around Dirk and suck energy out of him. Yeah, psychic vampires. Now, at the end of this scene, the Rowdy Three exit Todd's apartment through the window, which is arguably just as bizarre as them showing up in the first place. However, Martin pops back in for a moment to grab a picture frame off of Todd's desk. We later come to find out that this was a picture of our next relevant character. Amanda Brotzman is the 23-year-old younger sister of Todd. She lives alone, seemingly doesn't have a job, vents a lot of her emotional frustration out through her interest in playing the drums, and is partially financially dependent on her brother. This is because, as we come to learn, Amanda suffers from a debilitating physical condition known as pararibulitis, which runs in Todd's family. While obviously not a real disease, within the narrative, pararibulitis is a disorder of the nervous system that causes painful and frightening hallucinations in those suffering from it, and can seemingly be triggered both by blows to the sufferer's emotional state, as well as seemingly innocuous physical stimuli. A cool breeze could induce a hallucination of freezing cold, or the emotional state of feeling trapped could cause the sufferer to feel as though they're physically drowning and literally unable to breathe. Daily tasks could turn into a stress-inducing painful episode at the drop of a hat, and one can never really predict when an attack is coming on. As a result of her condition, Amanda has essentially isolated herself in her home. She doesn't really go outside and seemingly doesn't have a lot of friends or much of a support system, as she relies heavily on and confides a lot in her older brother. Wow, a person who suffers from a debilitating nerve condition that causes random bouts of pain and long-standing anxiety that makes it difficult to leave the house? Can't imagine why a character like that might have piqued my interest. Actually, as a side tangent, isolation is a big theme in the first season. Even though Todd is arguably a productive member of society, we do come to understand that he is socially isolating as a form of self-imposed punishment. Amanda is socially isolated through the fear she has in being unable to predict when her condition will flare up and the anxiety over how people will perceive her as a result of it. The Rowdy Three are socially isolated outcasts who predominantly only interact with one another and Dirk. Ken, the hacker, is partially isolated by Bart, the serial killer, and that's on top of him having partially been isolated before this through his job as a hacker. Bart is isolated herself in that she's literally never even been around another person for an extended period of time without killing them. Had to come back into editing to add this one, but Gordon Rimmer is also partially isolated in his little musician fanboy hoarder house in a run-down, barely populated neighborhood and only really interacts with the men of the machine. Sure, he's got a job, but I'm gonna bet you that guy hasn't got any friends. There's also a little more to his isolation in particular, but I can't really expand on it without spoiling a big plot point in the show. The agents who follow Dirk around are isolated from other branches of government projects as well as other resources and personnel. The detectives are isolated out of their and other investigations multiple times. We learn that the millionaire entrepreneur started socially isolating after his wife was killed. Equally, that then passed to his daughter, who he isolated from the world for the sake of her own protection. Farah is then isolated by proxy through her work as the bodyguard of the millionaire's daughter. The title character, Dirk Gently, lived in an environment where he was almost completely socially isolated for most of his life, along with multiple other people like him, which has resulted in the majority of them being very socially awkward and developmentally stunted. There's just a lot of themes of social isolation in the first season especially. I guess when the universe arbitrarily tasks you with being an agent of chaos and order, that can be a bit of a lonely life. Okay, so here's where we get to the real meat of the spoilers I mentioned. I was not exaggerating in saying that the Rowdy Three were psychic vampires. Seemingly, these guys don't actually eat physical food. Instead, they feed off of the emotional energy of those around them. The more intense the emotional output, the tastier it is. They even appear to be able to heal themselves through the consumption of this energy, since at one point Vogel's fingers are broken, and very soon after he eats, he's able to fight again without issue. And there's another scene where Martin, Grips, and Cross have been starved to exhaustion, and they also manage to regain their strength basically instantly after getting some neurological energy in them. They supercharge their own cells by leeching that energy out of others. Although, now that I think about it, Vogel may have instead been healed by the Bofuki Napoo, so take that with a grain of salt. This is why they run around smashing everything in sight and terrifying the living daylights out of anyone who sees them, because it's how they feed. Cross even specifically mentions that it's pain, fear, and confusion that they gravitate towards as delicious meals, which are all emotions that you could easily instill in a person by smashing everything around them and screaming like a maniac.
Like fear? No, 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 no. Confusion?
So crazy! We've never seen anything like it before!
Equally, however, this is also why they follow around Dirk gently. We come to find out later in the series that when the Rowdy Three feed on normal people, it's actually quite painful, and we can assume this is simply because normal people either don't have the correct energy or don't have enough energy to sustain their appetite without it basically draining every cell in their body. Think vampires feeding on babies. Babies don't have enough blood, so they are inherently more physically damaged through being fed on than an adult would be. However, as Martin describes it, other weirdos are fair game. Throughout the show, we are introduced to other fantastical strangers with bizarre powers governed by the unknowable whims of the universe. Dirk Gently happens to be one of those weirdos. This means that rather than feeding on and causing physical distress and suffering for regular people, the Rowdy Three follow around a perpetual food source whom they are aware isn't physically damaged by their feedings. Psychologically? Debatable. Dirk sorta exudes this air that he's either very good at shaking things off or just kind of forgets.
Do you know something?
I don't know anything. Ever. It's really quite relaxing.
So, despite their intimidating outward appearances and their destructive actions, the Rowdy Three actually do go out of their way to make an effort not to harm people. In this way. They will still beat you up if you're a prick. Now, it should also be acknowledged that Martin partially writes this off, explaining that the reason they go after Dirk in particular is because his energy is especially tasty to them.
He's got gourmet panic, ain't that right, boy?
But I kind of think that might just be a part of the outward facade that they've built for themselves. They could, theoretically, go after anyone as their next meal, but outside of their active feeding on Dirk, they seem to only make attempts to feed on regular people in defense. There's a whole scene where they're confronted by those government agents I mentioned, and despite the Rowdy Three knowing that feeding on regular people is painful and drains them of their energy, they make no actual efforts to do that until they are in a position where they are starving and forced to. Equally, the only normal person within the show that they were seen draining energy from was the same guy who threatened Amanda with a gun to her head. The Rowdy Three told him that they were gonna get him, and they did not lie. Much like the subculture their aesthetics are derived from, while giving no concerns for people in positions of power, personal property, or mass-produced consumer products, they do have a respect for a person's physical autonomy. While their existence essentially hinges on their ability to feed off of the emotional energy of others, they only take what they need from those who can afford to lose it. Like I said, obviously this doesn't apply to physical objects, as they will smash anything in sight. Windows, light bulbs, TVs, phones, cars, but the end goal of this is specifically geared towards terrifying their target subject so that they can suck up the emotional energy that results from that fear and anxiety. The Rowdy Three thrive through their ability to intimidate and instill fear in those around them, so their behavior is specifically catered to elicit the emotions they want. You could also boil down a lot of their actions and their disrespect your surroundings attitude to being a product of how they were treated or raised. Within the narrative, we learn that Martin, Grips, and Cross were held together in a government facility that not only made efforts to study them as supernatural anomalies, but sought to weaponize them. They were not the only people stuck in there, mind you. Dirk and many others were in there with them, though it is specified that the Rowdy Three were the first subjects to be contained. While we never actually see what their life within the facility was like at the time, we can probably assume that the three of them were kept together. They were probably kept away from normal people out of the fear of them trying to feed on those people, and they probably didn't have any personal property of their own. None of them want to return to the facility, specifically stating that they won't be put in a cage again, and their aggression seems to actively spike when confronted by people who are a part of that facility. They were treated like test subjects, animals, and potential weapons. This means we can assume a few things. Firstly, that they were, once again, socially isolated for most of their lives. Secondly, they may not have a solid grasp grasp on personal property value or the concept of physical things being important to people because they have limited experience in owning things for some of their lives. This could be why they break things regardless as to the law or a care that the person who owns the thing that they destroyed will have to replace it. Thirdly, they have been socialized to understand that instilling fear in people is not only how they can feed, but also how they can get dangerous people to leave them alone. Once Vogel was picked up and added to the group, to quote the man who was in charge of keeping them there, things got out of control. While never stated within the show, I'm personally of the mind that introducing Vogel to the group gave them this new, younger brother figure to protect, and things got out of control because the older members started lashing out in protest over him being treated the same way they had been. Equally, Vogel being the youngest meant that he probably specifically looked up to Martin, Grips, and Cross as role models, so he probably quickly started mimicking their behavior to more seamlessly integrate into the group. There's also a heavy implication throughout the show that if people make efforts to disrupt the plan the universe has for these strange individuals, then the universe will make efforts to correct it. Very Final Destination. So it's actually also possible that Vogel was born because the rest of the Rowdy Three were locked away, and they needed something to tip them over the edge so that they could finally escape. We're never actually told how long each member was living in that facility, but I think this might explain why Grips and Cross in particular are less verbally articulate than Martin is. Martin being older, he likely had more socialization experience than they did before being brought into the facility. Grips and Cross potentially mentally stagnated at a young age because of this, which would partially explain why they act the way that they do. If Vogel was also brought in at a young age, that would explain him as well. They were raised in an environment that mentally and socially stagnated them and encouraged them to display antisocial behavior in order to survive. Hell, Vogel expresses a level of self-consciousness about not being scary enough, which means that he exists in an environment where a person's ability to scare others on command is a desirable trait. It's a necessary skill to have for the sake of survival. Now, pair that with Amanda. Isolated, forced into antisocial tendencies for the sake of her own protection and mental well-being. Someone who wants to engage in similar destructive tendencies, but can't because she's impeded by her nerve disorder. There's a certain power and security that Amanda gets from the presence of the Rowdy Three. Even before she's properly met them, they are effectively stalking her from their van, but she is mildly amused and intrigued by this vehicle full of strangers willing to throw a brick through her window just to say hi. Given that we've already seen that the Rowdy Three are completely willing to tear into someone's home to get what they want, as well as to just toss people around like rag dolls, we can already tell that this approach with Amanda is a little different. It's almost like children being curious about a new playmate, but hesitant to approach. They're clearly intrigued by her, they want to be around and learn more about her, but they're also respecting her boundaries. She also gains confidence from having this looming, scary, mysterious, potentially destructive force lurking behind her. All of a sudden, her anxieties don't seem as intense if she's brave enough to throw a middle finger to a van full of dangerous strangers, only to have them shake their van in excitement. In this sense, the Rowdy Three act as a physical representation of her anxieties and fears, which effectively help her to look those same fears in the face and overcome them. Much like her pararibulitis, the Rowdy Three loom behind her as something that could definitely do her some serious harm, but equally something that she has absolutely no control over. She doesn't know if or when the doors of that van are going to fly open and a slew of gutter punks is going to spill out and clock her in the head, much like she can't predict when her next pararibulitis attack will come or what will instigate it. When Amanda has a pararibulitis attack in public, rather than helping this screaming, distressed woman who is very clearly in some level of pain, some insensitive onlookers just start filming her and commenting on how she's a whack job. Effectively, exactly what she was afraid of. Enter the Rowdy Three. The first thing they do is attack these guys, destroy their phones, and chase them away to give Amanda some privacy. Once they've done that, they drain Amanda of the excess energy coursing through her nerves, ending her pararibulitis attack. She then wakes up in her own garage after the Rowdy Three have driven her home and carefully placed her inside along with the groceries that she went out to get. These men literally carried her and the groceries home for her while she was passed out from exhaustion. Punk gentlemen. I'm pretty sure Amanda didn't even get to finish paying for her groceries, which means that the Rowdy Three might have done that too? I mean, Either that or they stole them, which is also totally plausible. Hell, the first thing we see Martin ever actually say to Amanda is a note of concern, asking whether or not she thinks that it's safe to just hop into a van full of crazy strangers. Now, without this context, one could easily argue that this want to be near Amanda comes from her smelling like a delicious potential meal to the Rowdy Three. But if they were only concerned with getting a tasty meal out of her, then they would just resort to terrorizing her in the same way that they do Dirk. The Rowdy Three don't care what Dirk is doing at the moment. When they're hungry, they're hungry. Despite this, they never actually make efforts to instigate Amanda's pararibullitis, they merely take advantage of it when it flares up on its own. And I think this is predominantly because they understand that this is physically painful for her when it happens. Contrast that with Dirk, who's never actually physically injured when the Rowdy Three come to suck him dry. Amanda even eventually gets to the point where she is trying to encourage her pararibullitis attacks because doing so will allow her to help the rest of the boys when she and Vogel are separated from them. She has grown from someone who was so terrified of her own disease that she hid herself away from other people into someone who now faces it head on without fear for the sake of helping the same family who helps her to overcome it. So this is where my thesis for this video comes from. The Rowdy Three are perfect tween fantasy bait. They are dangerous bad boys who will not actually do you any physical harm. They are protective, they are loyal, they are a found family unit. To top it all off, and in fairness this is partially my own speculation here and I could be totally wrong, I think they're asexual?
And if anyone asks, you can tell them that you're my, son. You're older than me. Grandson. Boyfriend. What? Ah! Ah! Calm down, this is just rude now.
I mean, it's either that or they're specifically mentally stunted around the age of 12.
Brother, one of the Martians is touching me again!
Vogel, we've been through this. This is not Mars.
But it might be Canada.
It's not Canada, Cross.
That guy's Canadian.
Meaning that there's potentially a second layer of ways that these guys would never do you harm. One of the biggest apprehensions that teens face growing up is the pressure to engage in spicy activities. So a group of loyal, secretly sweet bad boys who are never going to pressure you into engaging with them in ways that you're uncomfortable would be very appealing. In that regard, Amanda serves as a prime audience proxy, especially for an audience consisting of young women. I don't know how many of you guys would either be aware of this or who would actively choose to admit this, but cringy self-victimization and rescue fantasies are really common with young teens and preteens. It's why a book series like Harry Potter could become so popular, because a preteen is at the right age for a fantasy where they imagine what their life would be like if their parents died and they were whisked away to a brand new life. It's the Rapunzel phenomenon, which in fairness is not like a proper term for it, but that's what I'm calling it. The chosen prisoner complex could also work. I also took a second to look it up, and another possible title that's been forwarded by Helen Villiers, I definitely mispronounced that, particularly regarding the fantasy of being adopted, is Matilda syndrome, where young teens imagine what their life would be like if they were in a prisoner scenario and then rescued and taken in by people who would either keep them safe or make their life better. Or else they fantasize about being adopted into a more accepting family dynamic, or running off with some previously unknown but eccentric relative, or sometimes even an enticing stranger. In that regard, fantasies about running away to find that family dynamic would also apply here. Amanda does sort of run away to an extent. At the very least, she turns to rejecting the one family member who we've seen helping her, though she has a very good reason to do that. Trust me, Todd's not as innocent as he may appear. There's a reason his isolation is self-imposed. And the thing is, while I am focusing on Amanda and her relationship with the Rowdy Three, all of the main cast pairings have this rescued prisoner aspect to a degree. Todd was living his menial, monotonous life until Dirk and his chaos swooped in and scooped him up. Ken was working jobs he didn't enjoy for actively dangerous people before Bart rolled into his life and whisked him away for a higher purpose. Farrah's skills were being underutilized, and she basically existed within a constant state of paranoia until her life and career were completely upended into a chaotic state that seemingly fit her a lot better. Of course, that's sending her right into the arms of Todd and Dirk. You could also make a case that each of these scenarios would appeal to different types of people at different stages in their life. A 30-year-old working a dead-end job might heavily relate to Todd or Farrah, also wishing for a new best friend extrovert to just show up one day and take over their lives in fantastical and exhilarating ways. An easily frightened computer nerd in in their early to mid-20s might relate to Ken and wish for a violent weirdo to come in and tell them that they're special, which is also a very big part of this phenomenon, being scooped up by someone who is undeniably dangerous, but being that one person whom they would never hurt. Why do you think yanderes are so popular with tween and young teenage boys? Despite the fear that comes with being around someone who upends your life, it turns into exhilaration and excitement when you come to understand that their violence and dangerous tendencies are there to protect you, not harm you. They are directed towards everyone except for you, and especially towards anyone who would do you harm, whether that be physically or mentally. Todd was a prisoner of his own life and regrets. Ken was a prisoner of the dangerous circumstances he surrounded himself with, and Amanda was a prisoner of her own disease, probably predominantly appealing to young women. And so, each of them was paired up with a supernatural weirdo that uniquely complemented their specific brand of prisoner state. Now, the reason I focus on Amanda, outside of my own ability to relate to her because nerves and anxieties are wild, is because I recognize that this is the exact type of scenario a preteen girl would fantasize about. What if I was still beautiful, but I had this tragic, debilitating disease that isolated me from everyone until this harem of loyal, misunderstood bad boys came along to rescue me and take all of my pain away. Because let's be real, while boys are usually okay fantasizing about becoming literal monsters, preteen girls want to exist in this victimized state, but they also usually want to be beautiful, just in unconventional ways, I guess. You know, the sort of, she takes off her glasses and pulls down her hair and suddenly she's drop-dead gorgeous type stuff. Can't deny, Amanda's a pretty girl. Guaranteed, there are some reverse harem anime that already fall into this trope. I don't watch them a lot, but I know Ouran High School Host Club had aspects of this dynamic, in that the female protagonist, Haruhi Fujioka, was a poor kid attending a school for rich elites through a scholarship program, and so pairing her up with any of the main cast rich boys basically guaranteed her being rescued from her stressful, lonely, average life. That show even has a bad boy, kinda like the Rowdy Three, appear in the form of Ritsu Kasanoda. Yes, he was my favorite, how could you tell? Obviously, these self-insert fantasies change from person to person, and everyone's reasoning behind their own fantasy is going to be a little different. While one kid might have overly controlling parents, another might have neglectful parents. One kid might face bullying in their school life, whereas another kid faces it in their home life and acts out as a bully as a result. Ultimately, a lot of these fantasies just serve as harmless ways to experience things that we feel we are lacking in our lives, and while preteen fantasies can get a little extreme with their scenarios, I'm not here to shame anyone for doing something that is perfectly normal and harmless. Yeah, it's a little cringe and maybe disrespectful to make up a scenario where your parents were killed in a car accident and you were adopted by, I don't know, millionaire daddy warbucks, or to fantasize about having a disease or a mental condition that some mysterious magical misfit can come and cure you of. It's a pretty natural and harmless means of responding to or coping with emotional neglect. Though, speaking as someone who definitely had one of those fantasies and then went on to be diagnosed with a condition of that ilk years later, be careful what you wish for. Just saying. The point is, when considering these types of indulgent fantasies, the relationship between the Rowdy Three and Amanda Brotzman is a very good media example of exactly the scenario people may be looking for. The fact that it's written in a compelling way, taking out a lot of the issues that make these preteen fantasies so cringy, ridiculous, or unrealistic, makes it all the more interesting, both as an initial concept and then in its execution. I mean, sure, it's still unrealistic in that I'm pretty sure psychic vampires don't exist, who knows, maybe I'm wrong about that too, but the main story itself is weird enough that we can suspend our level of disbelief. The Rowdy Three act as Amanda's gateway back into the real world, even if it's through their own skewed worldview. They encourage Amanda to hurt the world in the same way that it hurts her, and they alleviate her anxieties by taking away the pain that she fears the most. As the saying goes, hurt people, and Amanda was most definitely hurting and in need of rescue. Certainly she wasn't getting it from Todd, who merely enabled and possibly even worsened her isolation out of his own guilt. I haven't been on Tumblr in a hot minute, but if this show had gained any real traction on there, we might have been able to count the Rowdy Three as 4 new Tumblr sexy men. Though, I guess, typically, Tumblr sexy men are cartoons because they're easier to draw and those trends are usually picked up and carried by artists, so my assumption could be very wrong there. For all I know, they would have just gravitated towards Dirk and Todd because main characters. If the Rowdy Three are developmentally stunted close to a preteen or teen age, that would likely just endear them to teenagers a lot more, having this sort of Lost Boys vibe to them, where they haven't fully grown up, run around doing whatever they want without being impeded by the laws of the land, and are led by a Peter Pan-like father figure in Martin. Speaking of which, Amanda is also very Wendy-like, in that Martin seems to take an interest in her that is a little more notable than anyone else in the group. Equally, her relationship with the other members is almost motherly at times. Martin has a habit of just sort of staring at Amanda, which is usually indicative of a character having deeper feelings for a person. A hanging question that people had about this show was whether or not there was a thing going on between Martin and Amanda. I don't know how old Martin is exactly, but he's definitely older than 23, and that is another thing that often plays into these preteen fantasies: the interest in older romantic partners. Potentially playing even further into this sort of trope fantasy, in the second season, Martin essentially passes leadership rights onto Amanda. There's a very real comparison to be had with the thought of Amanda being a witch and the Rowdy Three acting as her wolves, who would go out to do her bidding and track down her enemies. Like, I'm sorry, that also seems very ripe for tween fantasies, having a harem of wild boys who are at your side to protect you like a pack of loyal pooches. The Rowdy Three's tendency to howl in the midst of their chaos just makes that comparison all the more apparent. Another very easy parallel to make, especially by the second season, is that Amanda is a princess and the Rowdy Three are her loyal knights. Given that they started out as such a terrifying force, their development into what are effectively anti-heroes who help others not simply based on their own self-interest or desire to feed is definitely a product of Amanda's influence. She brings a tad bit of order to their chaos that focuses them down a path that is beneficial for the rest of the main cast. I'm sure there's also something to be said about girls who are born as the youngest to a family of all boys. Again, going back to Harry Potter because Ginny Weasley exists. The Rowdy Three are a found family unit, and they do basically adopt Amanda into their ranks. They ease into introducing themselves to her, only approach unprompted when she's in distress and in need of help, introduce her to their daily lives to see if it's something that she would be receptive to, support her when she makes an effort to stand up for her personal autonomy, and then very quickly switch to following Amanda's commands much in the same way that they do Martin's. All of them are older than Amanda, but they turn to her for advice on what they should do, just further showcasing how much the Rowdy Three trust her and her intuition. The loyalty that they have for her essentially compounds her as their new leader figure when she saves them from their own captivity in the second season, rescuing them from a hell that the boys were absolutely terrified of going back to. Because even bad boys have fears and anxieties, they just hide them a little better. The Rowdy Three saved her when she was at her lowest. Amanda returned the favor, and this effectively cemented their relationship. Something else cute about the dynamic between these guys that I noticed, at the end of season 1, Grips paints Amanda's nails with a vibrant green color. In season 2, she's still wearing that same color of green. Just adorable little tidbit. I like to think it's because she misses him. With regards to socialization, I think Martin is also smart enough to recognize that despite her own isolation, Amanda is better socialized than the majority of the group and probably overall better at interacting with regular people. So if the Rowdy Three are going to exist in the regular world, it makes sense for them to be led by someone who knows what she's doing, even if she's still in the process of her own self-discovery. All of these factors coming together is what made me look at this relationship and realize that it was a well-executed tween fantasy. Now, I specify the Rowdy Three and not the show, because the show can actually get pretty violent in some places. Like, I straight up would not recommend this to an actual 12-year-old. I can definitely remember at least 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 massacre scenes within the 2 seasons, as well as a not insignificant number of actual character deaths. Hell, one of the side characters is a serial killer, and she's technically a good guy. Side note, Bart is amazing and adorable, and if the Rowdy Three didn't exist, she would absolutely be my favorite character. Bonus points from her being portrayed by Fiona Dourif. I'm sure her role as a serial killer made her dad proud. So, note to anyone watching, maybe don't watch this show unless you're like 16 years of age or older. I think that was around the time that I started binge watching gory horror movies, so That should be fine. If you're too young for the show and you're just interested in Amanda's story with the Rowdy Three, a user named Scooby Snack has actually uploaded a compilation of almost all of the scenes of the group, both from Season 1 and Season 2. I say almost because I did notice one scene of them destroying a cop car and encouraging Amanda to join them that was missing from the Season 1 compilation, as well as some contextual scenes from Season 2. I'll put those in the description for you guys. Sure, you might be missing out on a lot of the broader context, which is way more apparent in Season 2 because Season 2 is conceptually insane, but I still think it's at least relatively easy to follow along for those who are curious. Like, if you go into this thinking Amanda's just the damsel the Rowdy Three saved, and then you watch her literally turn into a witch, you might be a wee bit confused.
I am a freaking witch-a-goo-goo!
I already spoke about Cristobal Tapia de Veer's amazing work with the music, but I have to also give huge props to the actors who played the Rowdy Three. Michael Eklund as Martin, Viv Leacock as Grips, Zach Santiago as Cross, Osric Chow as Vogel, Hannah Marks as Amanda, and while I didn't actually talk about her a lot, Emily Tennant as the Beast. They are all beautiful people, and I sincerely hope that they get more work. Anyways, I suck at ending videos, and thesis videos based on weird side characters are no exception. I'm sort of experimenting with different video formats and topics right now, and I figured that delving into a character essay might be an interesting reprieve, and obviously it makes a lot of sense to talk about characters I like because I think about them a lot. Gotta admit, the way that this script just flowed out of my fingertips was kind of nice. Seriously, outside of the artwork, I made most of this video in 2 days. That was so nice, in fact, that if people like this video enough, I might feel inclined to talk about other characters and character dynamics that I like. Possible in Trapdac video in the future? Who knows? To end things off, I would once again like to direct you all, provided I didn't screw this up somehow, to the charity fundraiser attached to this video. If you can, please help in donating to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Anyone who's ever wanted to send me money through Ko-fi or donations, or if you're currently donating to my Patreon, stop, take that money, and donate it. Share around stories coming out of Gaza, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan. I'm hoping to get a few more videos out soon, each of which will have a fundraiser attached to it geared towards supporting those affected by these ongoing conflicts. Even if something happens and I can't get these videos out, please still donate. Help where you can. There is absolutely no fucking excuse for the barbaric and disgusting practices that lead up to genocide being a part of a modern civilized society. We want to pretend like genocidal warfare is a crime of the past, a horrifying atrocity that we have since learned from and would never resort to again. But that belief is ignorant and wrong. There is no reality where we can call ourselves, as humans, a civilized people if we are okay with innocent civilians being traumatized, displaced, or killed because rich, desensitized, Islamophobic, racist fuckers have decided they don't have enough power. Take some notes from the Rowdy Three. Be punk.
I am punk.
Fight the power, rage against injustice, subsist on psychic energy, and stand against genocide. With all of that being said, I feel as though you guys have been looking at my stunted isolationist artwork for long enough. Let's take a peek at some of yours. Not to imply that you guys are stunted or wow, that was really poorly worded. Oh my god. First up, we have a pointy little me drawn by Sea Salt Cosmos, portraying me as I would probably be if I showed up in Rise of the TMNT, likely to marvel at my favorite character being a smarty pants. Nicely giving some contrast to all of my excessive green with some subtle pink highlights and just mwah, chef's kiss to those glorious angular points. With my squishy tail and a grin that would make anyone want to punch me in the face. You also have no idea how accurately this portrays my noodle arms. I promise you, it's spot on. Shimmying over to the sketch phase, we have a bee drawn by Fos Owo, showing us their own personal method of blocking and posing a human body for drawing, doing a wonderful job in using some decent base curvature to make a simple standing pose a lot more dynamic and visually engaging, along with all of the smaller lines that help add some depth to the tail and torso. Not to mention, I have basically no upper body strength, so this actually very accurately portrays how my body will just start leaning to one side. None of you guys have met me. I don't know how you keep getting all these things right. Drooling in anticipation over all of this gorgeous artwork, we have a Ponder Sprocket drawn by Kibble Maniac, giving her an almost club-ready top and chains to dazzle you with. Her hair even looks a bit longer and flashier, which I kind of really like. Ponder Sprocket with shoulder-length hair is a treat the way that you've drawn her. I've always had a bit of an admiration for sharper, more angular art styles because it contrasts the natural softness and curvature of physical bodies, and Kibble's portrayal here is no exception. Pick Picking up what you're putting down, we have Ponder Sprocket with an adorable little OC by Jinxel Void. Well, aren't you cute? Can't even see the character's face, and I know she's right. The gradient transition from the partially anxiety-instilling purple to the calmer tone of the blue was also a really great choice. It's like it's leading the audience through the process of being terrified that she could just pick you up and into a calmer state where you register her more protective motherly instincts being at play in doing so. Subtle, but effective. Ready to glam things up and put some sparkle into your life, here's a fairy-inspired Ponder Sprocket and Fiend by Lolo Dododo. I may not have ever watched the show, but it screams Winx Club, turning Ponder Sprocket into a fashionista of a magical girl, and with some platform high heels, very appropriate for a little extra stability when she comes down to kick someone in the teeth. The choice to use blue for the line art also helps to give her this sort of otherworldly fairy aesthetic, and pairs nicely with the lighter blues used for her and Fiend's wings. Also, an octopus fairy is just like the most adorable thing? For some interesting aesthetic choices, we have First Time Fashionista by Mako-chan VA. Mako wanted a rundown of the types of Japanese fashion trends I personally gravitated towards, and then created this outfit as a combination of the alt and sukaban aesthetics, but with pants, because I like pants. Even giving me a brand new hairstyle somewhat akin to a greaser pompadour, which is, incidentally, kind of similar to some hairstyles I have sported in the past, so it's accurate on top of looking hella wicked. I would absolutely wear this. Also, I just noticed that now my ears are robot ears, thank you? For a little bit of animated fun, we have Happy Baby Goes Pat Pat by Otra Artist. I do indeed like myself some animated media, so plopping the goodest of vigilante boys in and making him a pixelated wonder is awesome. His little blinking, the adorable blush under his eyes, and all the hearts just hovering around him are absolute perfection. I am honored that you would use one of my characters for practice in your artistic foray into pixel animation art, and I hope that it helps inspire you to even greater heights as you progress. Next up, we have a Pose to Perfection Ponder Sprocket by Internet Weirdo. They tried being all like, not my best work, but I proclaim that this work is lovely. There are a few necessities in making Ponder Sprocket. She's gotta have luscious hair, she's gotta have strong protective hugging arms and hips that she could snap you like a twig with, and she's gotta have those beautiful lips of hers. And frankly, I feel like you have succeeded at every endeavor because I would totally let this picture break my back and then kiss me better. Speaking of making you better, we have a Nurse Ponder Sprocket, All Too Happy to Oblige by Glitchy Neko. Well, my lovely patient, I'm prescribing you to some bed rest and watching some Ponder Sprocket videos, and some Octo Snuggles, gracing us with a very enticing pose that I think perfectly fits what was being put down here. I don't know this for sure, but I like to think that the patient chart belongs to Glitchy Neko themselves because their little credit logo is staring at me like they're mad I'm invading their medical privacy. I'm sorry, tiny cat, don't be mad at me. Tempting you in all the best ways this holiday season, may I present to you The Robot Slut Has Some New Gear On by Freak with a Tag. So, how do I look? Ha! The level of accuracy with this piece. Crescent is the very type of sexy manipulative smartass who would walk into your room dressed like this knowing exactly what he's doing. He's definitely getting something out of you being flustered. Let us all put our hands together and thank Freak with a Tag for this robotic meal. They made him shiny and sassy and beautiful all in one go, and I love it. Also, nice color choice. He definitely looks good in it. The shirt is, also very accurate. Not sure what to do about her sleepy little sidekick, here's a lovingly painted piece of Ponder Sprocket and Fiend by B.U. Can't? B1 you can't, blue can't? I'm sorry, I'm stupid. I get the vibe that Fiend was in the midst of trying to explain one of the many conspiracies he follows to his Ponder, only to have him pass out on her head while doing so because he definitely stayed up all night looking into it. And as she is always prepared to do, she supports her weird little tectopus buddy, even when potentially in her nightgown. A lovely, softly painted piece for a lovely, soft, sweet scene. And finally, turning me into a pretty pickle kitty, I have become the Pickle King thanks to Angie from over on Discord. With a dash of referential humor and a propensity for drawings of the feline variety, Angie has very adorably turned me into the rightful ruler of all that is green, making me look like the most lovable of squishmallows, only better serves my goals of subjugating the entire world. I am your king of pickles now. Bow to me and give me all of your gherkins. Meow. If you like any of these pieces, please do not hesitate to give some love to the artist through the links that I have provided for you down in the description. Also, please donate. Everybody could use some help this holiday season. And with that, man, I don't ever know how to end these things. Have some bloopers. All right. second recording, take 2, because I wrote this script in parts for some reason. Whatever, it worked. I don't watch them a lot, but I know Horan High School. Thank you, brain. Horan High School Host Club. That's staying in as a fucking blooper. What would Horan High School Host Club be? Oh no! Oh no! Oh, brain, shut up. Shut up. Stop thinking about it. Ugh. Ugh. Before recording, snap every bone in my head. Wait. Can I get the knee today? Can I get the knee? Oh! Oh!